Monsieur
Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Director General of the ICRC, Madam Director of Médecins Sans Frontières, Director of the Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development Studies. I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of CERAH and the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies, represented by its Director General, Philippe Burin. We're very happy to welcome you in this auditorium to celebrate the 20 years of the CERAH organization. The strong links with humanitarian affairs in Geneva are very deep indeed. They go back to the creation of the ICRC in 1863, which put Geneva in the map when it comes to humanitarian affairs. And in this city, you have the major agencies of the United Nations family, the Bureau for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNICEF, the UNDP, the High Commission for Refugees, the HCR, and the International Organization of Migrations. And these are the practical consequences of these humanitarian links between these organizations and Geneva. So, how to deal with emergencies and humanitarian problems. This is why we are called the capital of diplomacy, humanitarian affairs, and the links between humanitarian problems and our university are part and parcel of our history, the history of our alma mater, of your university, as Henri Dunant read science at this university in 1945, 1946, before committing to a career in banking. In 1859, he saw the atrocities of the war in Solferino, and he committed these memories into a book which will serve as a basis for the setting up of the ICRC. He said, our enemy, the real enemy, is not the neighboring state. It's hunger, cold, ignorance, routine, superstition, and prejudice. These words, I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, you'll agree, are very topical indeed nowadays. They speak to us, and this is what leads our university in developing its activities and strategic policies in the 90s. Increasing needs in humanitarian affairs highlighted the need to set up a training course in this field. We obviously want to help in this respect, and once again, our university took on a pioneering role, and it committed to these studies before a number of other university establishments, thanks to the vision of two professors, Professor Timothy Harding and Jean-Jacques Wagner. Our university committed itself to setting up the first training course on humanitarian affairs. And it paved the way for what was going to become in 1998, CERAH, celebrating its 20 years. So health, from the very beginning, was at the core of this humanitarian diploma, like the ICRC, which looks after the injured on battlegrounds, and MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, is devoted to looking after the ailing, and CERAH is involved in humanitarian affairs. We have set up a strong course here in Geneva with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. So we have a twofold center of learning as of 2011, led by Professor Doris Schäfer. CERAH started a very important reform to adapt to the ever-changing humanitarian world. All courses are now in English, And we talk about flexibility, modularity, and diversity when it comes to the lectures, in keeping with the needs of people involved in humanitarian affairs, and that encourage people to involve themselves in humanitarian problems. As CERAH partners obviously want to take part in the development of these activities, and it's a sign of the expression of will. So the University of Geneva is continue its cooperation with international organizations and humanitarian organizations in Geneva and elsewhere. CERAH is a symbol of this movement, and on your behalf I would like to thank all those who have made CERAH what it is today, in particular its director, Mrs. Doris Scheffer, and all those who've helped CERAH along to become what it has become today. Thank you for your support, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for these kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, why did we decide to talk about altruism to celebrate the 20 years of CERAH? CERAH is a meeting place, an extraordinary meeting place, which reflects what's going on in the humanitarian world today, with a diversity of partners, approaches and cultures, and increasing problems and facts. We take on more than 200 humanitarian professionals every year from Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, South Sudan, Mali, Mexico, to name but a few. This wealth of shared experience is strengthened by the cooperation we have with many humanitarian partners, Médecins Sans Frontières, ICRC, that have committed to developing CERAH from the very beginning. The dynamism of our lectures allows the students to think about the future of humanitarian affairs and critically analyze these developments. This evening's speakers, Rebekah Papadopoulos, President of Médecins Sans Frontières, and Yves Dacor, Director General of the ICRC, will make a presentation about this later on. There's a lot of cynicism about the world as far as humanitarian problems are concerned. We need to find our way back to our roots so that we can continue to alleviate the suffering of others despite political, demographic, climatic change that we are experiencing today. 2 years ago, I met a Syrian young woman who came to study at CERAH. She'd never left her country beforehand. Her greatest wish was to work for the ICRC. After a long selection process, she was taken on as an ICRC delegate. I asked her, Batul, if you had this choice, where would you like to go to in your first mission? And Batul looked at me and smiled and said, I would like to go to Yemen. She went to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I was wondering why she was so committed. Humanity, that's the very basis of humanitarian affairs, but why this feeling of humanity pushes us to help someone else? And that is the question we are putting this evening whilst we celebrate the 20 years of CERAH's existence. So the evening will take place in 3 parts. Kristen Monroe is going to tell us about her research on altruism. Then Yves Dacor and Rebekah Papadopoulos are going to share with us what altruism means for them in their respective organizations and why this is an extraordinary way to move forward, but at the same time represents a threat. And then Mr. Ambassador Valentin Selveger is going to present the position of a country that's always been involved in humanitarian affairs. The last part of the evening is a Q&A session, and you will be able to put questions to our speakers.
English, and would like to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Professor Kristen Monroe. In some ways, she incarnates the CERAH, as she is also, for lack of a better term, an offspring of the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute. She came to Geneva in 1966 to study for 1 year and told me that being in this city has changed her life in several ways. As a young American, being in what she still considers the most cosmopolitan city in the world, she realized that there's a big world outside America. She learned a lot by meeting people from different cultures, and she was also struck by the simple and spontaneous hospitality of Genevans, which I was very pleased to hear. Kristen then went to the University of Chicago to study political economy. While studying classical economics, she realized that altruism does not fit in the economic models. She was intrigued and wanted to explore the limitations of the paradigm of self-interest. She became more and more interested in understanding how the mind works, how people act, and what their motivations are. 30 years later, her list of publications is as fascinating as it is extensive in the field of international politics and moral choice. Her groundbreaking trilogy on altruism and moral choice during the Second World War was based on extensive narrative interviews of importantly ordinary people who experienced war. She helps us to understand a very important problem in normative political science and ethics: how people treat each other. We are particularly touched by her work as it allows us to examine the importance of altruism in acts of humanity, as human beings, as professionals, and as institutions. I would now like to ask Kristen to come to speak to us.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'll speak here. As Doris said, I was privileged to study at the University and at the Graduate Institute, and it did profoundly affect my life and left Geneva one of my very favorite cities, so it's a great honor to be back. I am, however, reminded of one of the jokes that I first heard here, told to me by a French Canadian, and it was, what do you call someone who speaks many languages? And the answer is polyglot. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks only English? American. So I am, with apologies for being an American, I have forgotten many, many things in the 52 years since I was a student here, and much of my French is part of that. So I appreciated the introduction, and I was able to understand what you were saying, but I don't think that you would understand me very well if I imposed my French on you. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is altruism. And I'm drawing on 3 books that I did primarily, and I would be talking basically about what altruism is, why it is important, and what causes altruism. The first, Doris has already told you, I was a social scientist trained at the University of Chicago. The dominant theory at that time was called rational actor theory, which assumes that people act out of the basis of their self-interest as they perceive it, subject to information and opportunity costs. And I thought that was a pretty serious theory, and the economics department at Chicago is a very powerful intellectual force. And then as I finished my first book, which is one of the best sellers ever for insomnia. My mother used to keep it by her bed. If she couldn't sleep, she would read it. I realized that a lot of the great debates that were going on in that field were really more about people looking at different parts of the elephant, if you will. And so I thought it would be interesting to step back and look at the theory, and standing up here in the bright lights, it's a good analogy because you have the rational actor model, the idea that people behave rationally, is like a very, very powerful light. It does reveal a lot about human behavior, but it's so strong that it leaves certain areas that you can't even see you're missing out on. And one of the areas is collective behavior, which is what most political action falls under. And the other area is altruism. So I tend to be a tidy person. I thought, well, there isn't that much altruism. I'll look at it first. That was in 1988 when I started looking at it, and I'm still trying to kind of figure out what makes altruism click. So what I did was I tried to construct an empirical study. I like to look at things in reality, not as a more theoretical person. And you find a lot of interesting things that you didn't expect, which is what happened to me. The first thing I did was I read everything you could find on altruism, which is what you're supposed to do, and I was pretty sure I pretty well explained it. I knew what other people had said. It made a lot of sense. And then I designed a survey that would go through. This is a very traditional way you're supposed to do social science research. You come up with hypotheses, you ask people questions that will get at that hypothesis. For example, do you give money in order to feel good about yourself? That's a standard economic theory. A man named Rebekah has argued this is what is called psychic altruism. This is what he says is how you explain altruism. You really get a nice warm feeling from doing it. And so I had a lot of other survey questions on a 14-page questionnaire, and it seemed very awkward to ask people questions like that with just sort of abrupt, and so I thought it would be better to just tell me a little bit about yourself. And I ended up developing a kind of narrative methodology where I ended up asking them about their lives and then would ask questions, and what they told me was really much more interesting than what I usually put down on the questionnaire. So let's just talk a little bit about what altruism is and then try to talk about its importance and what causes it. The simplest definition of altruism is behavior that is designed, even at possible risk to your own welfare, to help another person or a group of people. So that means that it has to be an action. You can't just think about it. It means that the intentions are what are critical. If I think you'd like to meet someone and I introduce you to them and they end up becoming an axe murderer and murdering you, that really isn't my fault because my intentions were good. So this is the kind of things that you think about. So that's the simplest definition. I think it's important not because it is so frequent. It's not behavior which happens every day. I think there are many instances where people do behave in their self-interest, and that's quite appropriate. But I think its mere existence challenges some of the basic tenets of a lot of dominant disciplines, from political science to social science, economics, anthropology, psychology, evolutionary biology. And so you have to ask about the limitations of those disciplines then. What is it that they will explain for you, and what areas can they not be so helpful for you? So what causes it? I tend to be a political psychologist. That means I'm interested in what goes on inside the mind. I think a lot of economics is basically doing that. They're trying to ask how people think about things. And I tried to design a study which went along a continuum, because I think you can find pure self-interest at one end of the continuum, and then we have evidence of more or less altruistic behavior, and then more pure altruism at the end. So I wanted to find different groups of people that I thought would fit into this continuum, and I thought entrepreneurs were a good first group to start of. These are people who try to take an idea, make a profit from it, and do a lot of wonderful things as a result of that. A little closer, moving a little farther from that self-interested point on the continuum, I thought of philanthropists. These are people who have money, make money, sometimes it's given to them by family, and they will give it away or give away parts of it. Then the next group I looked at were people who got the Carnegie Hero Commission Award. These are people who tend to not be firemen or policemen. They're not people who are professionally trained to save your life. They're people who instead simply are normal human beings who see someone in a lake and they jump in and they save them, or they pull somebody out of a burning building. And I'll show you some of the pictures of some of these people. And then the last group of people are people who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. And this was a very interesting group to look at because their actions had to go on usually for longer than just a day or two. Sometimes you'd have people for years with them. So just to quick kind of give you an idea, I had about 100 people I talked to formally in formal interviews that were transcribed, and then I would analyze them later. But I also spoke to a lot more people. What I did in the books were, and the first book is The Heart of Altruism, the second one is The Hand of Compassion, and the third one is called Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide. So I used archetypes, so the people who were typical of people in that group. So one of them was a philanthropist. This is Henry Segerstrom, who gave money to set up the Orange County Segerstrom Center for the Performing Arts. Second one is Lucille Babcock, who was a poetry editor of the Arkansas Gazette. She was about 70, and she had been involved in, as a woman in World War II, had done some things that were interesting there, but the reason I interviewed her and the reason she got the Hero Commission Award is because she broke up a rape when she was about 72. And this is a picture of her. She's demonstrating how she took her cane and beat the guy. And then the last group were people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. I'm happy to entertain questions on a lot of these people later, but this is Otto Springer, who was an ethnic German living in Czechoslovakia, who saved over 100 Jews before he ended up in concentration camp himself. And this is Tony, who was a colonel in the Dutch resistance, and actually later worked in the movie industry in England, California. He worked as an advisor to George Stevens on The Diary of Anne Frank, and is in the movie. He plays the role of a Nazi. So, what causes altruism? Well, first of all, it's not the usual standard socio-demographic characteristics that social scientists love. We like to think that people who are better educated are going to be altruists. Not the case. We like to think that sometimes religion will have something to do with that. That also was not the case. We found what happens is that there may be certain characteristics that some people have, others don't, and then I think of it as a trigger mechanism. There can be a certain socialization, religion, education in some cases may trigger what I think is the critical variable, which is the altruistic perspective, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit. It is not a conscious action. This was one of the things that was very difficult for me to understand. I would ask people, well, what made you make this decision? And they kept laughing at me and were very kind of bewildered, even puzzled. It's like, there's no decision to take, you just do it. So the whole kind of tradition that we have, I think, in Western philosophy, in literature and art, of the hero, the person who has a decision to make, and he paces the floor, agonizes over the decision. They call this agonistic choice. And as the sun comes up in the east, he decides to do the right thing, or he doesn't do the right thing. And that was not what I found at all with any of these people, which was very interesting for me. Okay, so what is the altruistic perspective? These are two quotes from people. You help people because you are human and you see that there is a need. There are things in this life you have to do, and you do it. This is a man named Bert. We all belong to one human family, a rescuer named Irene told me. So the first thing about the altruistic perspective is it's a different way of seeing things. Where you and I would see a stranger, an altruist would see a fellow human being. And so just as if you are in a foreign city and you meet someone and you hear them speaking French or are Swiss German, you'll say, oh, you're from Switzerland. And there's a kind of bond which is there, which you may not feel here, but you feel it abroad. So there's a kind of connections that's made. So the way they view the world is that we are all people, we're all one. And I thought from the reading that it would be the kind of Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft distinction that you have, that people who were communitarians would be more likely to be altruists, and I also did not find that. So here's a question, an answer to some question I had. Was there anything in common about the people you helped? Margot, who's was born in Berlin and then left Germany in Holland after Hitler came in. No, they were just people. You didn't know most of the people you helped then? No. So the worldview is it's a kind of universalistic. Being human is much more important than being a member of a certain group, and the societal relations are more important than liking a certain person. They were just people who needed help, Knud said. He was a Danish rescuer. These bonds of a common humanity was essentially the essence of altruism then. We're all part of a whole, like cells in your own body all together make up your body. In our society and community, we all are like cells of our community. That is very important. Not America, I mean the human race. You should always be aware that every other person is basically you. You should always treat people as though it is you. And that goes for evil Nazis as well as for Jewish friends who are in trouble. This is a man, Tony, who was condemned to death and lived underground in Holland for the entire war and managed to save over 100 people. The self-image that the altruists have is also quite interesting. They are people who are high on what we call agency. They believe that there's always something you could do, in contrast to bystanders I interviewed who felt there was very little that they could do. But the altruist's own self-image is not as important as their relationship of themselves, as the way they see themselves in relation to other people. They see themselves as very tied to other people. So just as you may go into a situation and you find close ties with someone who is Swiss or someone who's from your hometown or someone who is your profession. One of the people I interviewed was a man whose father had been saved because he was a soccer player, and the Nazi who picked him up recognized him. He'd played soccer with him. He put him at the end of the group, and that tie was enough so that when they were going around a corner, the Nazi interposed himself and said, "Get the hell out of here," and let him go, simply because of that. But altruists don't need that particular tie. They just would do that for anybody. So they saw themselves as people who are strongly bound to others through this common humanity. And this led to certain canonical expectations about what is normal behavior. And I came up with this concept because canon law refers to law from the church. And I think a canonical expectation is what we expect as normal and right. So for example, most of us expect parents to love us, to take care of us, to do good things for us. Now we know that there are many, many parents who are not good people, who fail in this obligation, but we still have this kind of expectation of what parenting should be like. And so the altruist expectation about what was normal behavior was very powerful and was quite different from what other people. So the second book that I called The Hand of Compassion actually comes from a quote by Otto Springer, who said the hand of compassion was faster than the calculus of reason. And that picks up the idea that it's very spontaneous. The other quote that I used in the book was from bystanders versus rescuers of Jews. The bystanders would say, "But what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis." And a rescuer would say, "But what else could I do? They were human beings like you or me." So this is something that became very important, that their self-image was so powerful that it dictated certain behavior. So just as if you have a computer menu, which we all have now, and apps on your phone, or a menu in a restaurant. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, it's very, very hard to get spaghetti bolognese. It just usually isn't on the menu. And the identity that these people had, their self-image of who they were in relation to other people, was so strong that it dictated certain types of behavior. And if it wasn't on your cognitive menu, you wouldn't think of it. So their view of humanity is captured in a quote by Tony. "I've always been interested in understanding what caused this Nazi monster to come to be. I finally realized every time you see the monster, you are looking in the mirror. I don't feel the Nazis are monsters. The Nazis were normal German people who, through education, training, cultural thinking, and greed, ended up where they were. Tomorrow it's our people, and the day after that, somebody else. History teaches you the minute you destroy an enemy, you look behind you, and he's standing in your own ranks. You have to many times look in the mirror to make very sure he hasn't crept into their head. So they were very aware of the fact that it wasn't that certain people are good or bad. It was a much more nuanced kind of view of things, so that your self-image is very important, but it's also in relation to other people. And this is where what psychologists call framing comes into play, so that you can frame situations so that someone will feel threatened or someone will feel very comfortable acting in a certain way. And this was very important for these altruists. Altruism, I mentioned the hand of compassion was faster than the calculus of reason. That indicates to me that altruism is very reflexive, not a choice. And this took me a long time to get. I kept asking people, but how did you decide to do that? And a wonderful woman named Madame Trocmé kind of laughed and said, there was no decision to make. And then she said, sometimes, she laughed, sometimes people like you, kind of you dumb social scientists, you come and ask us, how did you make a decision? There's no decision to make. If you think the Jewish people are your brothers and sisters, you have to behave a certain way. So they had very strong feelings about choice. Margot says, I don't make a choice. And you never wondered why you had to be the one to do this? No, it was war, honey, and everybody died. You didn't have time to think, to count your buttons, yes, no, no way. You acted, you had to act. Very fast behavior. Now, of course, sometimes it was very quick, but other times it meant you were taking somebody in, you had to plan strategically, you had to get extra ration coupons, you had to get people to take care of if they were sick, if you were not someone who was rescuing, if you were a hero, sometimes it would take longer to save somebody, but these people insisted it was no choice to make, they simply had to do it. And I think this is very important in terms of understanding what I think of as a cognitive menu. It's not a cost-benefit calculus at all. There was no conscious calculus, indeed. Again, this is the hand of compassion was faster than the calculus of reason. And that was very interesting. There now, since I started doing this work, there's been a whole kind of revolution in economics called behavioral economics, which is heavily influenced by work in psychology, which does the kind of thing I was doing coming out of a different tradition, which is to ask how real people actually behave. Do they behave the way the books say? Or do they behave differently? And that's why I think it's important to do a kind of empirical work on this. So, how do you reconcile the findings that I had, which is that it's a psychological process at work, with some of the contradictory findings that you might find by other scholars? So, a woman named Eva Hoffman has found, does a lot of surveys, massive numbers of people, and she argues that there are certain correlates of altruism, which is one of them is religion. And I think that I can use the analogy of coming to a talk. So I had to come from California, you had to come from wherever you came, but we all had to get into this auditorium before we could go to the talk. And I think altruism is very much like that. You may have a lot of different trigger mechanisms that trigger the altruistic perspective, a certain way of seeing things. But you have to see people. The common theme seems to be that everybody tended to see people in a particular way. And this is what I think is the critical variable then. Because otherwise, it's like you keep sifting and you finally get down to this is the one thing that everybody has in common. So I wanted just to kind of, wrap up a little bit and talk a little bit about why altruism is important. I think one of the things that it does is it teaches us that there's an alternative way of viewing the world. One of the things I found, especially when I did interviews with bystanders and contrasted those with altruists and with, I did some interviews with Nazis. That was an interesting experience. And what I found was that the bystanders had a very different way of looking at life in general. So one of the women I interviewed was a cousin of Tony. So her cousin was someone who had been living in hiding during the war. He died about 10 years ago, but his wife said till the day he died, he always slept with a gun under his pillow because he was so worried and just so conditioned that someone would come in the middle of the night. And he talked about what was important in life was being happy. And what is it that means to be happy? Well, you want to help other people. You want to be a part of a community where people care for each other. And if you look at the surveys on happiness, it's actually not the people in the Mediterranean where you would think maybe very happy. It's people in Scandinavia. Denmark is usually listed as the happiest place in the world because they're well cared for, they have health care, and they have a strong sense of community that will take care of them. And so the Beatrix, one of the bystanders, was explaining why she was not able to rescue Jews. She said she knew what was going on, and that was interesting to me. I had expected people to say they didn't really know, or that they wanted to do something and they were afraid. Nobody said that. One person said he was afraid, but everybody else said, well, I knew, but there wasn't anything I could do. I wasn't in a position to help. And so Beatrice's explanation was she's married to a wealthy doctor. Her father had been a wealthy doctor. She was very low on agency. Her mother had been dying, and her father sent her to take a book and said, but don't go in and see your mother. The mother asked to see her, and she would not go in because she'd been told not to. She later lived and did what her husband suggested she do. And she said, there really wasn't anything I could do because I had help in the house. I had servants. And if I tried to hide somebody in the house, she had a huge house, I could be turned in by the servants. And then she turned, earlier in the interview, and this is why I love doing long interviews, she said, I always had a very good life. I was very spoiled even. I always had leisure time to play squash and tennis. Because we had a lot of servants. And I thought that was very interesting. The reason that she had a good life is because she had servants who could give her the leisure time to do the things she wanted, and that also meant why she could not do this. She could not help anybody because she could be turned in by the servants. In contrast, you find the altruists with a very different concept of what makes people happy, and several of them, one did not put the picture on because of time, but he was John Widener, who lived in Geneva when he was a young boy, and he organized an escape network from Holland through Belgium into Geneva. He would ski in. At one point, someone asked him about why he wasn't wearing socks when he was skiing, and he said, "Oh, he didn't need the socks." Well, he'd given his socks away to somebody else, so he was skiing with just the shoes on, no, or the boots. And he also took people into Spain. And he said that he knew lots of people who were happy, that they have more and more money, but that isn't what makes them happy. And he said, what makes you happy is helping other people. And so I think one of the final importance about altruism is not just the theoretical or academic importance, but what it shows us about what it means to be a human being. I think it offers us a picture of what it means to be a human being that's much richer than the picture that we get if we look at the kind of evolutionary biological picture, or the economic man, or the psychological man. And it shows us as a picture of people who are uniquely tied to other people through these bonds of common humanity. And one of the people, Madame Trocmé, who was in Le Chambon, which is an area in France that saved a lot of people. Her husband was a minister who preached, this has nothing to do with politics, we simply cannot turn in our Jewish brothers and sisters. And she described the day they came to take away the boys in the orphanage where she was working. She was saved because she was fixing breakfast and she had an apron on. And so they thought she was a maid. She was not anyone of consequence. And so they didn't arrest her. They took her cousin who was running the orphanage with her. Her husband was hiding out in the woods at that point. And she described having her young son come with her to see if there were any boys that had managed to hide. And she said he was very sick. His face was very green and upset. And he was, "Mother, we cannot do these. We have to revenge this. This cannot go on." And she says, "But you know what your father says? If you revenge, then it will go on and it never stops." And she said he was very quiet and he didn't say anything. And then she says, "Always remember in your life that you will have a choice to make, not about others, but about yourself." I would not say more. And so I'd like to leave you with that thought. You think about what it is that you want to be as a human being, what it is that you're leaving behind you when you go, what is the legacy for your children and for the people who are left behind you. And I think altruism shows us that you can be an altruist, you can be very happy, you do not have to live in a kind of dog-eat-dog world. Thank you very much.
very much for this inspiring talk, Kristen. I would now like to ask Rebekah and Eve to come with us. Rebekah perhaps here and Eve there. So we have Eve in the middle of the two ladies here, exactly. And I was told I have to sit here, so there's a bit of a distance. So just to briefly introduce, without long stories, Rebekah Papadopoulou has been with MSF since 1995, worked in many different countries in different positions, including as a member of the International Board, which is the highest governance body of MSF, and since 2017, she is president of MSF Switzerland and the operational center here in Geneva. And Yves Dacour has equally a very long experience in his organizations, 26 years, and since 2010 is Director General. So both you know your organizations very well. You know also what drives people to work in your organizations, to put themselves at risk. And you also know what altruism means for you and what it means in your organization. So just my very first question to you would be, after what you heard about what is altruism, what drives us to behave as altruists in life, what does it tell you? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to you in your organization? Yves, would you like to start?
First of all, can I just say happy birthday to CERAH. It's great to be here today to be able to celebrate 20 years of, I think, a remarkable journey. And it's great to know where we are. Kristen, I thought it was very interesting to hear you, and I think it made me to reflect on 2 or 3 issues. If I think about our own organization, and I'm not sure I'm right about that, but somewhat the visions of our founder were fundamentally altruism. In a sense, they were asking, and they still ask us today, to look at the other and to take the risk to think and to behave as the other is a human being, whatever he or her functions. If you think about that, that's just remarkable. In a way, it's asking people, and at the time soldiers, to look at the enemy and to accept that the enemy can be a human being when he's hors de combat. There is something very powerful in terms of driving altruism and so much going beyond just, I hope you're altruist as such, but somewhat asking as an organization and people to be altruist. So there is something very, very strong. My second reflection was, and maybe it's a reflection which is more related to today, I don't feel that altruism is happening in a vacuum. Altruism is happening also, and it was interesting to hear about what the last example was saying. It's not just about the other, it's about yourself. That's very true. But it's also about the other. And we're living in a time as a humanitarian actors where the other, the people, the communities affected by war or by violence, are not always welcoming your altruism. And that's a very interesting reflection which has obliged us, I think, as an organization and as a person also, to think differently. It's not just because you want to think about the other or do something for the other, but you need to do something relevant to the other. You need to do something strong, because if you are just willing to do something which is positive for the other without reflecting what it means for the other, it's just your own problems. And that's interesting. So what I want to introduce, maybe in the reflections, is doing something for the other, even taking risks to do so. There is suddenly in the equation something new, which is the relevance. We can't impose anymore to people humanitarian actions. This time is over. People are watching us very carefully, and I think rightly so. And they expect that our altruism is, of course, relevant, needs to make sense. Otherwise, you can stay at home. You can be altruist with your parents, with your families, but don't come to me, to my place, to my suffering, if you're not relevant. There is really something here, which I found interesting. I was reflecting listening to you. And maybe my third reflections is, of course, if I just connect that again with the CERAH, maybe, and I was reflecting humanitarian education, what happens when altruism starts to be professionalized? Can we professionalize altruism, right? Maybe that's the question. And if I just reflect on my own organization, I don't know if we have professionalized altruism, but we have tried to manage altruism. And I am of the opinion that the ICRC and some of our leaders at the time, when they thought and they reflected about the famous humanitarian principle, which are not that old, right? We're talking about the 60s when they really started. It was a way also to manage and somewhat to frame altruism. Because what you didn't want is to have an ICRC delegate or Red Cross person being altruistic and making some choices about only his own altruism or her own altruism. What you wanted is somewhat that there was a way to be altruism, almost to manage that through neutrality, impartiality, humanity. So think about that. It's interesting. The principle there, it sounds something extremely generous, but it was somewhat also to manage altruism. So the question I would ask myself is, are we able as an organization to manage altruism? Are we able to professionalize altruism? And what does that mean? That's maybe the first reflections I would like to share, listening to you and to your very interesting speech.
Thank you very much. If you can keep your microphone, you're allowed to keep it. And we'll come back to this issue of professionalization, which I think is a big thing looming in humanitarian action and with relation to spontaneous altruism. But first, let's listen to Rebekah.
Yeah, actually how I can follow after this, but first of all, the congratulations for the celebration of today, but also in advance, really thanks for creating this moment, because I think that as you mentioned, we are coming from different ways, but we find ourselves here now and today, and that opportunity. My first, if you want, reflection as I was hearing is that, as you said, I'm celebrating 25 years in the humanitarian work, but almost never asked myself why. So I was listening to you, and I was saying, okay, which is my why? How I find myself on what you explain, and how I find my organization on what you explain. And the second thing that you said a lot, but is around choices. Do we have choices? You know something? I think that one of the things that I'm learning every single day through the action of my organization, because altruism is an action. It's not just a willingness to. It's an action. All these years, I realize that it is a choice. It is a choice to stay next to the one who is suffering. It is a choice of alleviating, acting for alleviating the suffering of the other. And that, it reflects segments of our societies, because speaking for the solidarity as an action, I'm referring to the collectivity of the altruistic action, to the humanitarian action. We are segments, we are mirroring our own societies, or at least segments of our own societies. And we are manifesting the collective decision or interest of segments of the society to stay next to the ones that they are more or most in need. So the individual action and the collectivity of the action for me was one of the elements that I found extremely interesting. And what also I found extremely interesting is a couple of very important discussions as it came from some of the people that you interview. I will refer to Tony And I will refer to his moment of saying that when you see the monster, the bad, the one who is creating the suffering, by the end of the day, maybe you are looking yourself on the mirror. So for me, the action of altruism, the action of acting to alleviate the suffering of the other is also a form of resistance. And it's a form, you very elegant said, it's the why the altruism? It's because it's indicating, it's demonstrating that exists another way, not only the way that the established reality of the Nazis, the established realities of the Rwandas, of the genocides, but they are other realities. So for me, that's one of the important triggers, is an action of resistance. I will come back on the professionalism, professionalization, but I think that the most important thing is moments like this, reflection like this, they were always of an intellectual interest, but for me, the humanitarian action, which is the organized form of altruism, I would like to refer in two more points very quickly. Or the concept of altruism, it's not a romantic concept, because it's not an innocent, it's not a neutral. We are witnessing across the history of humanity altruism becoming an instrument very often, as well as humanitarian action, the politicization, the manipulation of humanitarian action. Don't forget that we have wars on the name of the humanitarian action. If that was the case in the decades of 19th, of early 2000, today we are, in my opinion, living in the period where altruism, solidarity, is criminalized. The action of alleviating the suffering of the other is criminalized. The very simple action of people escaping, fleeing war, death, misery is criminalized. We are living today the criminalization of solidarity. And there is where, and I hope that I will have the opportunity later in the discussion, to see the altruism through the lens of the realities of today. What is the calls for us as individuals and for us as organizations within this new political environment? And I will leave it here.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. So we have several themes, and we have a limited amount of time before we turn it to the audience. So let me just say a little bit of the themes I see emerging, but then I would leave it to you which one you want to pick up, and perhaps also talk more about, in reality, in your organization, what does it mean? What have you seen? How can some of these things be translated? How can some constraints be overcome? So one theme, Eve, which you brought up, is really altruism, but what is the need of the other? And how can the need of the other influence our altruistic behavior? So that's perhaps one thing we could talk a little bit more about. The second thing certainly is humanitarian action these days has become buried under guidelines, standards, etc., which is necessary. We want to be more effective, we want to make good use of the money, etc. But it also constrains, and we heard a lot that altruism, it's not a choice, it's a reflective behavior. You are altruist, you want to do it. So how does this corset we are living in, what does that mean, and how do we deal with that in the organizations? And then the third thing of Rebekah, which you brought up now, which is extremely important, is the changing environment. We had politicization of humanitarian action, militarization of humanitarian action, and now we have criminalization of humanitarian action. And for me, I have only been in the field for about 40 years now, but this is the first time I see criminalization of humanitarian action. So I think these are three themes I see emerging, and I would leave it to you, perhaps, Eve, to take another turn and just see on which ones you would like to reflect and provide some more input from the ICRC perspective.
I just need...
Yes, it's on.
Is it on? Perfect. I hope I will not add on to the complexity or to the theme, but I think there is two elements I would like to bring. I think the first one is about the trust. I think we all know when we talk about humanitarian that part of the key element of also altruism is not just a gesture, is the fact that this gesture is a two-way element, right? So somewhat what you are creating is, and I really like what you said about individual altruism and then collective altruism. As an organization, what you're trying to do is not to build only on individual altruism. You can't. You have to make sure that the way you do altruism to others is understood, is also on mid to long term. There is a commitment. You can't just do a one-off and you're out. So the trust then is really at the center of what you do in order to be able to do that. And we are living in a world where I think we feel that possibly that trust has become a much rarer commodities, not just between us and the people. I mean, the time where you would just come and say, hi, I'm the Red Cross, trust me because I'm the Red Cross, this time is over. People would rightly so check at us and says, okay, first of all, prove it to me that you are really Red Cross, and maybe you are Red Cross, but then show me that you are doing a good job, that you're really humanitarian, and it needs to make sense to me, right? I see that constantly, not just with people where we want to be altruist, but also with the people who are controlling the other people, the famous, non-state armed group, government, and how difficult it is right now. And here I agree with you. What has happened already is we're living in a time where, yes, we don't want humanitarian actions, we don't want altruism to be there because it will allow hope. And we're living in a time where, in fact, and I see that very much related not only but to health, I'm deeply convinced right now we're living in a time where health has become the new battlefield. And if there is something about altruism, if there is an area which is really altruist, for me, is health. I mean, in a way where you ask to treat the persons, where you are doing that with really altruism based on the need of the person. Health is the new battlefield. If I just look at my own organization, I still have today hostages around the world. And what is amazing, most of them are health workers and are women. It says something also about the world in which we operate, the world where, in fact, you don't want people, the other, the civilian, the people that you want to put under pressure, you don't want them to have hope. You don't want them to think that altruism is possible. So on purpose, you control that. You reduce this space. So I would say for me it's even worse than criminalization, is on purpose. You do not allow altruism anymore. And here it's government, yes. I mean, let's talk about even European government, the legislation, the legal framework domestically in which we operate makes truly altruism sometimes criminalization, very clear. It could be, depends if you help somebody who's the wrong person, the enemy, the migrant, you could absolutely be punished for that. It's also non-state armed group, and the way war is fought, which means today, in fact, altruism being not anymore something recognized, but on the contrary, fought against. So I think there is really something which is deep here, and I think which we absolutely need. If I would reflect, that's something which I would really bring in the discussions around the trust and the fact that altruism kills, or killing altruism kill hope. And strategically, this is really what we see more and more in conflict.
Thank you, Rebekah. Just follow on.
Of course, I cannot resist. I will just take it from here. Actually, I would like to discuss about us and them. And I think that's nothing new. I think it was always in the history of humanity. It was around these two poles, us and them. But today we have a new construct where them, they are demonized because, as you are saying, it's much easier to destroy if they are dehumanized. And there is the drama, in a way, of the altruists or of the humanitarian action, because we are somehow between us and them. in our communities, in our societies. We are the ones that we are offering services. We are trying to alleviate their suffering. And by targeting the humanitarian action, you will allow me, maybe, I'm gonna do it because in any case MSF is quite famous of not being politically correct. What we are witnessing, at least I will use the example of 2015 and the bombardment of the Kunduz hospital, the bombardment of the clinics, of the hospitals, of the ambulances from Israel to Yemen, to Syria. Actually, today, more and more, this action of violence, this action of targeting, and I want to come on medical care under fire, the targeting of the medical action and the symbolism. Today, the single fact of being a nurse in some of the context in which we are operating, it makes you a legitimate target. That's the symbolism. And I don't know if it is targeting the hope, but definitely is targeting the very sense of human being, the very sense of humanity. And there is where I strongly believe today that the action of altruism, the action of humanitarian workers, of the role of humanitarian organizations is going back to the basics and defending humanity, defending some of the, and I'm coming back on some of the words of the people that you interview, that we are one, and by targeting the one who is offering care, you are targeting the very concept of humanity. But today also we need to realize that we cannot continue with the practices of our own past, and I want to come on the new environment, because today the very single fact that somebody is trying to escape misery, death, it makes him or her illegal. It makes and throw her, being a woman, a child, or a man, to appealing conditions, being the detention centers in Libya, being the borders with Mexico, or being the Nauru in Australia. And that becomes the new norm today. And that becomes more and more accepted. And that is feeding and contributing on the new creation of us and them. Keep them out of here. But my concern on our own organizations is that this us and them, we reproduce it also internally in our organization. And in what sense? Because sometimes, you are right, we were obliged to professionalize. We were obliged to professionalize because we need to improve the quality of care that we were offering. We need to have real professionals for giving the best services to the people in need. But in my opinion, with this over-professionalization of the action of solidarity, we are somehow losing our soul. We somehow give the very action of solidarity to the professionals in the sense of standards, in the sense of protocols, of guidelines, of respecting norms. And where is the empathy? Where is how I can sit as a nurse, as a medical doctor, next to the one that I know that I'm not able to save his, her own life? How can I really sit next to the ones that I know that potentially, even if you refer, we are on the 25 years of the genocide in Rwanda, and I'm thinking very often my colleagues, the MSF colleagues, the ICRC colleagues, that they were there. And they were treating people that they knew that once they will be out of the clinic, they will be executed. And what you do there? And how far any type of professionalism will ever help you on that moment. So remaining humans and caring for each other, it's on the basis, and I think this is what we need to continue defending, especially on these new political environments.
Thank you, Rebekah. I will give a final word now to Eve in the panel, and then we still want to have a little time for the audience to ask questions.
I just wanted to reflect quickly, and I'm not sure I'm right, but about professionalization. And if I look at my own organization, it seems that we have somewhat make a complete 360 degrees loop. If I look at our new strategy, we have really insisted to put people affected and community at the center of what we do. You would say, but that's what you've done since 150 years. But we realized that maybe we've professionalized for good reason. We have all the standards, we have the guidelines and all what is needed for a big organization to be able to work together. But maybe, as always, it's time also to recognize that we are also valuing individual altruism. And what we're asking is our people take the time to listen what people are telling us, radically listening, challenging our own assumptions about what they need and how they work. And maybe by this altruism, being able to challenge our own policies and practices. And it's interesting to reflect a little bit about that. Professionalization leads you somewhere, but somewhat you have to re-allow in your own organization or to give the space to people to challenge your own organization. And if I just reflect it, I've seen over time people in my organization or in MSF and other challenging our practice, and they were basing that possibly, not only, but also possibly because they were able to be individually totally obsessed by the other and by their needs. And they felt that maybe our policies and practice were not able to respond to that. I like this idea that professionalization can be also challenged by altruism. And in a way, in 2018, 20 years of CERAH, maybe one of the reflections we need is to give again space to altruism and to protect altruism in our organization.
Thanks a lot. I would like to ask Ambassador Zellweger to give us his views very briefly, and then we will pass to the audience for some final questions.
Rector of the Université, Director General of the Graduate Institute, friends of CERAH, ladies and gentlemen. The Swiss Constitution says in its preamble, the strength of a people is measured by the well-being of its weakest members. Altruism, solidarity, and dignity are at the heart of any functioning society, not only in Switzerland, everywhere. In fact, their absence is a sign that a society is not in good health. Human beings are, as a Greek philosopher said famously, political animals. Humans are not isolated monads. They are part of a group, and more importantly, as we have heard also from Professor Kristen Monroe, they feel part of a group and they care for their group. It is probably one of the more comforting findings of recent scientific research that the rational choice approach has told, again, as Professor Kristen Monroe has told us, clearly has its limits. The so-called Homo economicus is a fiction, and many will say, fortunately, it is a fiction. Human beings not only pursue their own self-interest or their economic benefit, they also adhere to other values, human values, social and societal in nature, that are equally important to them. Today's science is still trying to find ways to measure these, shall we say, a bit less rational values mathematically, and to integrate them in its models of human longing and behavior. But the fact that scientific research has not yet produced hard and measurable results on the importance of such values certainly does not mean that they do not exist. The core of altruistic action is the respect for humanity, the respect for our own kind. Respecting the human being, providing care, assistance, and protection has no borders nor other limitations. It goes beyond any kind of political or other differences and hostilities between people. In fact, this very insight defines the revolutionary approach of Henri Dunant. The principle of humanity applies to everyone, also to members outside our communities and even to our enemies, as Yves Dacour has reminded us. Or to say it in Dunant's words, to help without asking whom. Today, this principle is a cornerstone of most, if not all, the activities in International Geneva. We can say that International Geneva is built on this very insight, be it directly, like in the work of humanitarian actors, of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or WHO, etc., or indirectly, by securing a safe and healthy environment, or by ensuring the basis for prosperous societies through trade and innovation. CERAH, we all know it, is an important part of these Geneva-based activities. As a unique and innovative platform, an academic platform for humanitarian action, CERAH has contributed for the last 20 years to the strengthening of humanitarian professionals and actors. With its training programs and its research projects, it offers the unique opportunity to simultaneously combine up-to-date academic know-how with the insight of the humanitarian work on the ground. I would like to convey on behalf of the Swiss government my sincere congratulations to the 20th birthday of CERAH and for its outstanding contribution to humanitarian action. We all look forward to seeing you carry on with your invaluable work, and we wish you all the very best for your future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Although I learned a lesson, we have to be very careful not to over-professionalize in CERAH. So we'll really keep that in mind, and I think our students learn a lot of soft skills also while they're here, which I hope will be useful. Now we have some minutes to take some questions from the audience. There are microphones on both sides. So raise your hand if you would like to ask a question directly to any of the panelists. Please be brief so that we can take several questions and then have a final round with our panelists. There's a lady here, and perhaps just very briefly say your name and where you come from.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melody. I'm a graduate of the Graduate Institute. So, quick question. Qu'est-ce qui nous pousse à aider autrui?
What pushes us to help other people? But also, who?
Pushes us, but who? So my question is, Yves, you speak of managing altruism, but who teaches altruism? And when is it a little bit too late? And perhaps maybe reflect on, if you consider yourself an altruist, why and from who? Voilà.
Thanks a lot. That's a big question. We'll not restart the whole evening discussion, but maybe we can have some short reply. It's so difficult here because we're just in the middle of the night. Any other hands? Yes, there's a lady here in the middle. Just raise your hands if you have more questions, then we can already go around with the microphones.
Hello, my name is Karali. I have a question. Altruism is going out of your way to help someone, but what pushes someone to go out of their way to harm someone or make damage to someone or something? Is it something that is innate or something that is learned? Thank you.
Very interesting question. Thank you. Okay, if there are no other hands up, so I think one question would really be kind of what is the other side of the altruistic mirror or the altruistic medal, and what determines the identity of those people. So that's a huge question, of course, and maybe not going into depth to answer this question, but it clearly is also going to the question, one humanity, and you include there those who do the damage also, and we see that, of course, a lot in the humanitarian conflict zones. You have to deal with that, and how far can you really go with that, and what triggers that behavior on the other side. And then perhaps there was the question, how do we manage altruism? And I think you talked about managing altruism, so perhaps just a brief reflection on that. Kristen, you want to go first? Yes, you will get a microphone. Yeah.
Got it. Well, there are lots of really good questions, and a lot of them relate to each other. I think the last two questions are very closely related. Who teaches altruism? Is it too late? And what causes someone to go out of their way to hurt someone? That was what the second question was. I think the answers to those are very similar. I think altruism can be born into people. I think some people have an innate predisposition towards it. If you look around, some people are natural nurturers. Other people not so much. And I think the question of why you go out of your way to hurt someone is in some ways answered by why you go out of your way to help someone. I think there's something that triggers something in you. Often it can be framed in a certain way. You see the suffering in someone that you don't see otherwise. I think the question of why you go out of your way to hurt someone relates to what Rebekah was talking about with the us versus them mentality. I think that's very common. We're seeing it much more, I think, in recent years than you have before, but certainly it's surfaced a great deal of the kind of Tajfel theory of social identity was developed out of the Holocaust, which is why is it that prejudice comes, and I think there's an innate need, I think, to feel good about yourself, and what Tajfel says is that we define ourselves in relation to other people and in contradistinction to them. So who am I? Well, I'm not my sister. I'm not like my mother. I'm going to be different than that. And what happens at a social group level, especially if you have a politician or a political leader of some kind who draws on that, which unfortunately I think we do in the United States today, is that you begin to think of yourself as different from, and that has to be better than. And so there's a lot of experiments that demonstrate this, that if you want to stir up hatred, and a lot of times politicians do it for their own selfish ends, it helps them get elected, you will oppose groups against each other as opposed to showing that you can work together. So you mentioned, the ambassador mentioned scientific work on altruism, and there is some work that shows with groups that have altruists in it actually do better than groups that don't. And then the last thing I don't want to monopolize this, but I thought that the question about that Rebekah raised, she said, this is my work and this is how I find myself. And I think the answer to the question of what happens when altruism becomes criminalized, I don't think this is the only time it has been criminalized. Certainly in Nazi Germany, it was against the law to help people. And I think this is an identity question. You are someone who has defined yourself through your work. It makes you feel good about yourself. It is who you are to help other people. That is your identity. And I think you have to stand up and say, this is wrong. We as a people are not people that want to turn away refugees, or we are not people that want to build a wall and keep people out, as is being proposed in the United States. And I think the way you stop the criminalization of this and the persecution of people who are trying to help people is you have to come forward and say, this is the wrong identity. This is not who we are. We as a group of human beings are as a people, if you want to use that terminology, are better than this. We deserve something else. So I think it's very much an identity question.
Thanks a lot. So I will give your final word and then a final word to Rebekah.
I was just trying to answer your questions about not just the what, but who makes you altruism, and just trying to respond to for myself. I think, first of all, it's always easier to be altruism if you somewhat recognize yourself, or there is somewhat a connections between you and the person that you are altruism towards. And to give you just an example, it's not just giving you are giving, but it's also what the other is giving. And maybe just it was for me last week. Just I traveled to Nigeria, to Maiduguri, to pay respect to a family of one of my colleagues, Haiwa, that was just executed by Boko Haram a few days ago. And what was really impressive for me was the discussion with Mohammed, his father. He's a man of 60 years old, very charismatic, tall. When he came to meet me, he was well dressed. We were sitting together, and I saw what the death, and I had bad news to him because I was bringing him evidence that his daughter was killed. I saw that on one hand how it really cut him in two, really, physically, the suffering. At the same time, his ability to reflect his dignity, his love, in his ability to immediately make sense of what his daughter, Haiwa, was doing for us and of what it meant for his family, for his community. No bitterness, a lot of sadness, but a lot of love. I tell you, he has given me and my colleagues so much that I'm really bringing that with me, and as a person, and I realize that you need also, as a professional altruist, if I would say, to sometimes have this very, very strong connections who brings you directly in who you are and why you're doing that. The father of Hawa has given me a lot of strength and love, and I feel that very deeply. So I think altruism is also related to people who give you that at a very special moment, and I think you should cherish this moment. My second point is just about managing, and I just would like to make one point. And I don't know in CERAH if you're studying that, but I'm struck about one thing. People who are doing altruism, when you do that collectively, it's very powerful. You're very closely connected with your own identity, with your missions, with your team. At the same time, I must realize, after now spending quite some time in this world, that you are very generous in altruism with the other, but this generosity is not always the same between then people in your team. I'm struck by how much in humanitarian world, including my own organization, but also in hospital, also in places where you are dealing with altruism somewhat, the relationship between people is tough. How much there is sometimes a lack of respect. And I'm reflecting, I not have the response, that in a way, if you collectively show altruism, there is something about the relationship between us showing altruism. So when there is a crisis, you work well together, but there is less crisis. The relationship between humanitarian in the same organization or between organization is something which challenged me very much. So when we talk about managing, it's not just managing the altruism, it's also reflecting what does that mean for our own collective respect and relationship. And here we still have a lot to learn and manage, that's for sure.
Very important. I'll give Rebekah a final word. Please go ahead.
No, it's a very quick point. I don't pretend to respond to questions. I think that the colleagues, they really respect. I want to insist and highlight the concept of individual responsibility. Because it's true, you can be a standby, you can act yourself on harming the other, or you can choose to be in solidarity with somebody. We should, and I'm saying this to myself every single day, being a president of a humanitarian organization. And I want to bridge the individual responsibility and managing altruism. I think that one of the mistakes, or maybe speaking on for my organization, that we are driven with from our need to do better, to do more, to alleviate, to bring quality on the response by over-professionalizing, by managing the best that we can. I think that we are struggling, we are killing, we are driving in asphyxia the individual choices of people to stand up and be, as for example, the colleague of ICRC who was executed, to choose to go to run a very isolated place in North Nigeria. That's a personal choice. That's an individual choice. And somehow we need to be extremely careful on how we are managing in a way that we are taking out the power of people from their own choices. And the last point is that we keep thinking, we speak for the altruism, the heroes, but honestly, I think we are, if I consider myself as a humanitarian worker, I feel that I'm taking back so much more than what I'm giving. And when you are talking about the tensions in the teams, in the groups, it's the same. If we are not treating each other with respect, with humanity, how we can protect, and I'm coming back on what you are saying, do not harm is the fundamental principle of the humanitarian action. But if we cannot really care and respect each other, how we can pretend that we will respect the ones that we are trying to assist?
Thank you so much. Kristen, I think we need to go to a close. You want to have a last...
A very quick comment. I think what you're speaking of touches very directly on one of the points you made, which is that we have to have empathy for the other person. And one of the sweetest stories I heard was during the Holocaust, Jews were hidden and they had to have Christian identities and Christian names. And one of the Jewish people who was hidden said, her sister, these are 7, 9, 10-year-old kids, always leaned over at night when she said goodnight to her and used her Jewish name. It was reminding that she had an identity that was still there. And I thought that was very sensitive. And I think that's the kind of thing that you're talking about. You can't just do what we think is good. We have to constantly ask whether or not this is what the person needs, and ask them directly and be very sensitive to that.
Thank you, Kristen. And the final word for...
Thank you very much. Just two quick points. It was said that we have to be careful not to professionalize altruism. I'm not sure whether that's really true. Why not professionalize altruism, at least to a certain extent? If we look at the current crises, and you mentioned them at the beginning of the evening, these huge humanitarian crises, I'd rather have professional humanitarians coping and dealing with them than altruists who do so out of a mere impulsion, but not with professional knowledge. Eve has indicated that the principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, in fact, also manage and professionalize altruism to a certain degree because they give a frame. And I think that is extremely important. But professionalization does not mean that apart from that, we can all remain altruists, because altruism is also an attitude. It's the knowledge that we're part of a community, that we're part of mankind, and that we have obligations one to the other. And just another point, there was a question, what pushes people to the contrary, to all these atrocities? I was, as a young diplomat, I was in our embassy in Nairobi during the genocide in Rwanda in '94. And I will always remember we had to evacuate the people that came out from Rwanda. And one of the things that really struck me was today we speak about the 800,000 people that were killed within a few days. But what was then the most striking thing was the immense horror of the stories that the people who just came out of Rwanda in April '94, the tremendous horror that they had gone through. And I always wondered what pushes people to that. And I think one of the elements could be, and it was mentioned, it's about the other. If a society, and that was very strong in Rwanda, starts to speak about the others and then increasingly disqualifies the other and calls them by animal names or whatever, that is probably the beginning. And then people who do not, raise their voice, and that is where you point with the individual responsibility comes in. If they don't raise their voice, they become like slowly hostages, and they just witness how things degenerate. So I think in the end, altruism is also closely linked to courage. The courage to play a role, to live your consciousness of being part of a wider group, and you do have responsibilities. So courage goes with altruism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very nice concluding round. I would really very much like to thank our 4 speakers, panelists, and I think we could spend another evening, another day discussing this. So much more to say, but I hope it has triggered some reflections, some ideas on why we're all here, why we do what we do, and of course how we can carry on doing what we do, because I think that's also an important message, what drives us and what continues to drive us. And the testimony you gave from Nigeria, I think, is extremely powerful. Thank you all for sharing tonight, and thank you all for having stayed with us until now. I wish you a good evening.